Welcome everyone to tonight's Campfire Candlelight story. In this original bedtime story, Private Detective Ambrose Sinclair is called upon to investigate the mysterious disappearance of a New Orleans theatre owner. We kindly ask that you like the video if you enjoy the story. Also, leave a comment below if you want to hear more Ambrose Sinclair detective stories on the channel. And now, settle in and relax, because we are about to begin our tale. The unfinished performance. The soft glow of a kerosene lamp cast long, dancing shadows across the worn Persian rug that covered the floor of Ambrose Sinclair's study. The room was a curious blend of the old and the new, and proudly displayed his eclectic tastes. Antique bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes on everything from criminology to botany. A large, mahogany desk, cluttered with papers, inkwells, and a peculiar collection of magnifying glasses, dominated one corner. A comfortable armchair, upholstered in faded velvet, sat beside a small round table where a half-finished glass of absinthe waited. The study, while a sanctuary for Sinclair, was also the head office of the Sinclair Private Detective and Investigations Agency. Amongst the antique bookshelves were tools of his chosen trade, a state-of-the-art microscope, a collection of lockpicks, and a variety of disguises. A crowded, solitary desk against the wall served as Sinclair's workbench, where he could analyze evidence, experiment with new forensic techniques, or simply escape the noise of the city of New Orleans. Sinclair himself was a study in contrasts. Tall and lean, with a shock of prematurely greying hair, he carried himself with an air of both elegance and ruggedness. His sharp, intelligent eyes, often hidden behind a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles, held a world-weary wisdom. A faint scar, a memento from a youthful duel, marred his left cheek, adding a touch of intrigue to his otherwise handsome features. His attire, a velvet smoking jacket and silk slippers, belied a more adventurous past, hinting at a man who had seen many of the world's splendors as well as its darker side. The tranquility of Sinclair's study was interrupted by a sharp knock at his front door. He sighed, a mixture of annoyance and resignation etched on his face. As the only full-time private detective agency in New Orleans, he expected knocks at all hours. He just didn't always want them. Rising from his armchair, he moved with purpose towards the door, his hand reaching for the antique brass doorknob. As he opened the door, he was greeted by the familiar faces of Officers Murphy and Dubois. Murphy, a towering Irishman with a face weathered by years of hard police work, stood imposingly in the doorway. Beside him was Dubois, a wiry Creole Frenchman with a sly grin and a keen eye. "Evening, Detective Sinclair," Murphy began, his voice a low rumble. "We've got a bit of a problem." "I don't think you would have knocked at my door without one, Officer Murphy," Sinclair responded. Dubois, knowing Sinclair possessed a natural curiosity when piqued, interjected, "It's an interesting one, monsieur. It has the captain very perplexed." "Well then, Officer Dubois, what is this mysterious matter your captain obviously thought I might be able to assist you with?" "A big-time theatre owner, Daniel Small, has vanished. No trace, no sign, just gone," Dubois said. Sinclair raised an eyebrow, intrigued. He knew Small from various cabaret shows and theatre productions he had put on over the years. Sinclair also knew Small owned the Grand Opera House, the most prominent and famous of theatres in the city. His lawyer, Monsieur Flock, attended our station today and informed us that Small disappeared 2 weeks ago, Dubois continued. 2 weeks ago? Sinclair asked. And he's just reporting him missing now. "The captain said the exact same thing, Detective," Murphy said. "But Flock is still down at the station if you wanted to come with us and speak to him." Dubois was right. Sinclair was intrigued by the disappearance of Daniel Small and agreed to accompany the officers. As they stepped out into the gaslit streets of New Orleans, a warm wind swept through the air. The city, a vibrant tapestry of life and death, was shrouded this evening in a veil of mist. The trio climbed into a horse-drawn carriage, the rhythmic clopping of hooves echoing through the night. As they jostled along the cobblestone streets, Sinclair took in the sights and sounds of the city. He'd been around the world but was drawn to New Orleans not only for its need for its first private detective agency, but also for its fascinating blend of new and old worlds. The dim glow of street lamps illuminated the faces of passers-by, revealing a mix of backgrounds and origins. New Orleans was an old trading settlement situated on the Mississippi River, inhabited for thousands of years by Native Americans and built up by successive European kingdoms and colonists. A city still healing from a civil war whose wounds could be seen in the eyes of the people Sinclair passed in his carriage. Before the French and Spanish arrived, this area was once known as Bulbanca, the place of many tongues. It was still that place, Sinclair thought, and it was fascinating to him. The carriage pulled up to the imposing stone facade of the New Orleans Police Station No. 1. They descended from the carriage and stepped out into the damp night air. Sinclair straightened his coat and sleeves, and then, with Murphy and Dubois, the three entered the building. The interior was a labyrinth of dimly lit corridors, echoing with the sounds of footsteps and muffled conversations. The air was thick with the scent of stale tobacco. Sinclair's keen eyes scanned the surroundings. He noticed the worn wooden desks, the faded portraits of wanted criminals, and the grimy windows that overlooked the bustling city streets. A group of officers hunched over a large table were poring over maps and a stack of wanted posters, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp. The most senior in the group seemed to be pointing out various spots on the map. This was a world he had come to know well, a world of powerful interests and powerless pawns, where the line between justice and corruption was often blurred. Officers Murphy and Dubois led Sinclair to a small, dimly lit interrogation room, where 4 people sat around a table, 2 men and 2 women. They introduced themselves in turn. There was Mr. Flock, Daniel Small's lawyer. He was a short and heavy-set man with a worried expression on his face. The other man, taller, introduced himself as Mr. Tilbury, a business acquaintance of Mr. Small's. Sinclair noted he spoke with a prominent East Coast accent. The 2 women were Beatrice and Gladys Small, the missing man's sisters. They wore similar stern looks on their faces and appeared genuinely unimpressed with being in an interview room of a New Orleans police station. By his own reckoning, Mr. Flock was one of the last people to see Mr. Small before he went missing, Dubois explained. He and Mr. Tilbury. Right then, Sinclair said, sizing up the small crowd. I'll begin my interviews with the 2 of you. Officer Dubois, if you wouldn't mind escorting these 2 ladies to a different interview room and see what information they might possess on their missing brother. Certainly, Dubois responded, and lent a hand to the women before taking them down the narrow hall to another room. Mr. Sinclair, I'm so relieved you've agreed to take on this case, Mr. Flock began once they had the room to themselves, his voice filled with hope. My client, Daniel Smith, has disappeared at a most inopportune time, and I fear the worst. If anyone can find him, the captain assures me it's you. Sinclair, unfazed by the lawyer's earnestness, responded calmly, "I'll do my best, Mr. Flock. If you can provide me with any information, no matter how small, it could be crucial." Mr. Flock hesitated, his eyes darting nervously. "There's not much to tell." Mr. Small simply vanished. One moment he was here, the next, gone, without a trace. "You said this was an inopportune time for Mr. Small to go missing." "What did you mean?" Sinclair asked. "I can shed some light on that detective," Mr. Tilbury interjected. "Mr. Small has entered into an agreement to sell his theatre business to a group of investors from Boston, which I represent. The sale includes all of his theatre properties in Louisiana, including the Grand Opera House." Tilbury continued, "The day he went missing, he had deposited the first payment, $1 million. It was half of the total purchase price." Sinclair looked up from making his notes. "He was being paid $2 million. Yes, that was the agreement. But now that he's missing, it's all in doubt. Mr. Small's disappearance has caused my clients a great deal of concern, and they are adamant the deal be finalized." "When did you last see Mr. Small?" Sinclair asked, turning his attention back to the lawyer. "It was 2 weeks ago," Mr. Flock began. "I was at the Grand Opera House office with Mr. Small and Mr. Tilbury. It was a little after 6 in the afternoon on Monday. The work for the day was complete, and we all had just left his office. Mr. Small bid us good night, bought a newspaper from a street vendor, turned up the collar on his jacket, and walked down the street. And that was 2 weeks ago. He hasn't been seen since." "Why did you wait 2 weeks to report this?" Sinclair asked. "I've been out of town," Flock explained. "I've just returned to New Orleans from making arrangements at all his theatres in Louisiana for the sale. No small task, I assure you." "So how did you learn he was missing?" Sinclair asked. "When I returned, I spoke to his secretary, Mr. Doughty," Mr. Flock continued. "Doughty is his right-hand man, and hadn't seen him since that day 2 weeks ago. In fact, Mr. Doughty was so distraught by the whole situation, he handed me his resignation. I then went straight to Mr. Small's wife, Eleanor Small. She claimed to have not seen him either." "Interesting," Sinclair said, making notes in a small notebook he had pulled from his coat pocket. "There is another thing, minor in comparison to Mr. Small's whereabouts," Flock said, lowering his voice. "There were $150,000 in bearer bonds in Mr. Small's safe at the office. They're gone. I'm certain they were there when I left town." "Why did you go into Mr. Small's safe?" Sinclair asked. "To retrieve his last will and testament," Flock said. "As a precaution, in all honesty. I knew it was there because I drafted it myself for Mr. Small." "And who is the beneficiary of Mr. Small's estate, if you don't mind me asking? You, by chance?" "Heavens no," Flock sputtered. "It's Mrs. Smith, of course. I'm merely the executor." Sinclair closed his notebook. "Thank you, gentlemen. You've given me much to consider. I thank you for your time. Should I need anything else, I'll seek you out." As Sinclair escorted the 2 men out of the station, he saw Officer Murphy and Dubois helping the 2 sisters onto their carriage. Sinclair called Dubois over. "Officer Dubois," Sinclair asked, "did you learn anything in your interview?" "Well, there is no great love between them and their brother. They were quite unkind in their description of him," Dubois said, with a small smirk. "But I don't think those 2 are fans of anyone or anything for that matter." "Yes, I got that impression as well," Sinclair said. "Anything else?" "They seem to believe Mr. Smith was more than just missing, that he's deceased," Dubois said. "Said they had a feeling, that they just knew because so much time has passed. They even asked where we intended to look for the body, the harbour, the city's garbage dump, the incinerators. They appeared, eager for us to begin. Sinclair stood silently on the stone steps of the police station for a minute, mulling all of this information. "Officer Dubois, I think we should speak to the secretary, Mr. Doughty, next." He apparently knew Mr. Small well. "But of course, Detective," Dubois replied, and turned to go fetch Murphy. The address Dubois acquired for Doughty led them to a dilapidated rooming house on the fringes of the French Quarter. The building, once a grand mansion, now stood as a crumbling relic of a bygone era. Peeling paint, broken windows, and an unpleasant odour hung in the air. "Officers, if you don't mind waiting outside," Sinclair said. "I feel Mr. Doughty might be more forthcoming without officers of the law standing over him." Sinclair climbed the creaking stairs, each step echoing through the silent hallway. The door to Mr. Doughty's room was slightly ajar. With a gentle push, he opened it and stepped inside. The room was small and cluttered, filled with stacks of sheet music and theatrical props. A single candle sat on a small table, casting a dim yellowish light. Doughty stood beside his bed, packing a ragged, stained suitcase with clothes. "Mr. Doughty, my name is Ambrose Sinclair. I'm a private detective looking into the disappearance of your boss, Mr. Small." Doughty spun around in surprise when Sinclair had started talking, and just stared at him with his mouth slightly open. "Mr. Doughty?" Doughty managed a meek, "Yes." "As I said, I'm investigating the disappearance of your employer. I was wondering if I could ask you some questions." Yes, of course," Doughty said, regaining his composure. Doughty, visibly nervous, took a seat. "What can you tell me about Mr. Small?" Sinclair asked. "Mr. Small? Well, he was a complex man. Started at the bottom, at a young age. Worked his way up from a small-time ticket taker to a theatre magnate. He had a knack for business, a ruthless one at that. He'd do anything to get ahead, including stepping on a few toes along the way." Sinclair leaned forward, intrigued. "Anything specific you can tell me? Any enemies, perhaps?" Doughty hesitated, his gaze wandering. "Well, he wasn't exactly the most beloved man. He was a gambler and a womanizer. He'd often enchant the chorus girls in his productions with promises of fame and fortune, only to discard them just as quickly. And as for enemies, well, making enemies is part of any business, isn't it?" "And you, Mr. Doughty, were you one of his enemies?" Sinclair asked pointedly. "Certainly not. I've worked for Mr. Small for 5 years. I did everything for him as his right-hand man," Doughty said defensively. "It's true. I only earned $5 a week in his employ, most of which goes straight to the owner of this lovely abode. But he always said my day would come, that I was due." "And has your day finally come?" Sinclair asked. "What do you mean, Detective?" "There are $150,000 in bonds missing from the safe in Mr. Small's office. I imagine as his right-hand man, you would have had access to the safe," Sinclair said, leaving the unspoken accusation hanging between them. Doughty's discomfort was palpable. He fidgeted nervously, shifting in his seat and avoiding eye contact. His hands trembled as he reached for a glass of water on his desk, his knuckles white. "Mr. Doughty," Sinclair said, his voice low and steady, "I'm not here to judge. I'm here to find the truth. If you know something, now is the time to tell me." Doughty hesitated, his lips pursed. I don't know what to say. Mr. Small was a complicated man, as I said. He had a lot of enemies, a lot of secrets." His voice trailed off as he stared into the distance. "I took the bonds for safekeeping. Mr. Small said I'd be taken care of after the sale of his theatre empire, I simply wanted to make sure his wishes were followed. Doughty stood up and went to the suitcase he had been packing. He lifted the top layer of clothes, exposing a stack of official US government bearer bonds hidden beneath. "I see," Sinclair said. "And Mr. Small's disappearance? What can you tell me of that?" "I had nothing to do with that, I assure you," Doughty said. "The deal had been finalized and he left the office with Mr. Flock and Mr. Tilbury. I never saw him again." "Very well," Sinclair said. "Do me a favor and wait here a minute." Sinclair exited the rooming house and saw Murphy and Dubois waiting patiently by their carriage. "Officers, I think you should go inside and place Mr. Doughty under arrest," Sinclair told them. "In his suitcase you'll find the missing $150,000 in bonds. He was clearly preparing to flee the city. I believe he might know much more than he's letting on." After arresting Doughty and loading him into the carriage, the group made their way back to the police station just as the sun began to rise over New Orleans. Officer Murphy escorted Doughty inside and led him downstairs to the holding cells. Sinclair followed, watching and listening to Doughty's protests. "All right, that's enough from you for now," Murphy said, and slammed the rusty cell door shut. As they turned and walked away, Officer Murphy turned to Sinclair. "He says he doesn't know anything, but do you think he had something to do with Mr. Small's disappearance, Detective Sinclair?" "I can't say for certain, but without a confession, we'll have to keep investigating," Sinclair replied. "I think we should pay a visit to Mr. Small's wife, Eleanor. She might be able to provide some insight into where he might have gone." At the top of the stairs, Officer Dubois rejoined them. "Have you seen the morning paper? Have a look at this," he said, handing Sinclair the newspaper and pointing at the main headline. Sinclair read the article and handed it back to Dubois. "Yes, we'll definitely need to speak to Mrs. Small," he said. "What's it say?" Murphy asked. "Mr. Small's two sisters have accused Mrs. Small of having him killed, for revenge and the money," Dubois said. "The paper even claims to have interviewed the assassin she paid to do it." "Well, officers, what are we waiting for? I think it's an excellent idea to go see Mrs. Small before she has the same idea as Mr. Doughty and tries to flee town." Sinclair, Murphy, and Dubois arrived at the imposing Victorian mansion that served as Daniel Small's residence. The grand house, a testament to Small's self-made success, stood tall and imposing against the backdrop of the city skyline. Its ornate facade, adorned with intricate carvings and stained glass windows, hinted at the opulent lifestyle of its former owner. As they approached the wrought iron gates, a sense of foreboding washed over Sinclair. The once vibrant home now seemed shrouded in an eerie silence. The three men approached the door and knocked. After a few moments, the door opened, the lawyer, Mr. Flock, standing there to greet them. "Detective Sinclair. Officers, welcome," Flock said. "Mr. Flock, this is a surprise seeing you again so soon," Sinclair said. "Have you seen the morning paper, Detective?" Flock asked. "I came over to see Mrs. Small as soon as I read those lies by Daniel's sisters. Outrageous accusations. All false, of course." "Well, the accusations are something we'd like to speak to Mrs. Small about. Is she in?" Sinclair inquired. Of course," Flock responded. "Please come in. Mrs. Small will be down shortly." Flock swung open the imposing double doors of the mansion, revealing a grand foyer bathed in the soft golden light of the morning sun. The high ceilings, adorned with intricate mouldings and ornate chandeliers, created an air of grandeur and elegance. The walls were lined with framed playbills from various theatrical productions, each a reminder of Small's successful career. portraits of renowned actors and chorus girls, as well as personal photographs of Small himself, hung alongside the playbills, offering a glimpse into the world of theatre. A grand staircase, sweeping up to the second floor, dominated the space. The staircase was lined with plush, velvet carpets and ornate wooden railings. To their right was the parlour room, with a large marble fireplace, flanked by comfortable armchairs. The air was filled with the faint scent of expensive perfume and polished wood. As Sinclair looked up at the imposing staircase, Mrs. Small emerged at the top. She was a woman of a certain age, her face etched with lines of worry and fatigue. Her attire, though expensive, was devoid of any ostentatious display of wealth. She wore a simple dark dress and a modest hat, her demeanour serious and sombre. "You're the private detective?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I suppose you're here about Daniel." "Yes, ma'am. I'm Detective Ambrose Sinclair," Sinclair said as she descended the stairs. "And yes, I've been engaged by the department of these fine officers to figure out where your husband has gone." "Come with me into the parlour, please. We'll talk there," she said. Once everyone had found a seat, Sinclair pulled out his notebook and cleared his throat. "Mrs. Small," Sinclair began, his voice gentle, "I understand this must be a difficult time. Can you tell me why you waited 2 weeks to report your husband missing?" Mrs. Small sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Daniel often disappeared for days at a time. He'd often be off with one of his chorus girls, celebrating a successful production or a lucky run with the horses. With the sale of the theatres being finalised, I simply thought this was just another one of his escapades." "So you were aware of your husband's other activities?" Sinclair inquired. "Well, I suspected as much, but it was his secretary, Mr. Doughty, who would keep me informed of his whereabouts," she said. "The way Daniel treated that man, I'll never understand." "Mr. Doughty is under arrest for the theft of $150,000 in bonds from your husband's safe," Sinclair said. "In fact, he's our leading suspect in your husband's disappearance." "Oh my," she responded quietly. "So you believe my husband has been the victim of some foul play?" "Well, it is a possibility," Sinclair said, "and according to the morning paper, one you may have played a part in as well." "Lies told by lazy, no-good siblings and published by an unscrupulous newspaper to sell more copies," she retorted. "Why would Mr. Small's sisters make such serious allegations?" Sinclair asked. "Heavens if I know," she said. "We've never gotten along, but this is beyond what I thought even they were capable of." "So you deny any involvement in your husband's disappearance?" Sinclair asked. "I most certainly do," she said confidently. "Had I wished harm to my husband, it would have happened long ago. I accepted his flaws, forgiven him his transgressions, and the marriage has endured." "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Small," Sinclair said, rising, Murphy and Dubois following suit. As Flock escorted the 3 men to the door, he said, "This has all been such a whirlwind. In fact, I was served with papers today by the representative of the investment group. They're applying to the court to have Mr. Small declared legally dead." "Why would they do that?" Dubois asked. "To complete the theatre sale, I believe," Flock said. "Without Mr. Small present, it cannot proceed. But if he was declared dead, it would fall to Mrs. Smith as the inheritor to complete the transaction." "Thank you, Mr. Flock," Sinclair said, and bid him good day. As they walked back to the carriage, Sinclair asked the officers to look into a matter for him. He informed them he had further inquiries of his own to make as well, and that they would meet again at the police station later that afternoon. Later that day, Sinclair walked up the stairs to police station number 1. eager to get out of the heat of the afternoon sun. But the shelter of the station would not be the respite he was looking for. Inside was just as hot, possibly hotter, and tempers were flaring. A small group of people had Officer Murphy encircled. Sinclair recognized Mr. Tilbury, the representative of the investment group, as well as Small's two sisters. "You have Mr. Doughty in custody. He obviously did it. Why haven't you charged him?" Tilbury demanded. "Clearly my brother's wife put him up to it," Beatrice Small stated emphatically. "You have both culprits right in front of you." "They both had axes to grind against our brother," the other sister Gladys chimed in. "Officer, why haven't you brought them to justice?" Murphy just stood in the middle of the group. Each time he opened his mouth to respond, another person would resume the barrage of demands and pointed questions. Seeing Sinclair walk through the front door of the station, Murphy immediately let out a hearty, "Detective, over here, sir. There's some questions for you." "Officer Murphy, if you could escort our guest to one of the meeting rooms, I'll be able to address them all," Sinclair said. After Murphy successfully corralled the three into one of the rooms, Sinclair asked if Dubois had returned yet. "Yes, he did, Detective. And then he left again on that second task you wanted," Murphy replied. At that moment, Officer Dubois appeared at the station door with Mrs. Small and the lawyer Mr. Flock in tow. "Excellent timing, Officer Dubois," Sinclair said. "Please escort them to the meeting room and we shall begin." The meeting room walls were bare, save for a handful of faded posters of wanted criminals. A long wooden table dominated the center of the room, scarred and worn from years of use. A single bare light hung from the ceiling, casting a dim, yellowish light. Everyone was seated around the table, save for Sinclair and the two officers, who stood by the door to watch what was about to unfold. "I thank everyone for coming in again," Sinclair began, as he slowly paced around the table. "I know the disappearance of Daniel Small has had an impact on each of you." "Why is she here?" Gladys Small demanded, casting a pointy finger in Mrs. Small's direction. "Do you plan on arresting her?" "Arrest her? No, I shall not be arresting Mrs. Small today," Sinclair said. "You've already arrested Mr. Doughty," Tilbury said. "We all know you've got the scoundrel responsible for this behind bars." "For theft, yes," Sinclair said. "The disappearance of Mr. Small is a different matter entirely." "So why are we all here then?" the other sister, Beatrice, demanded. "Well, I'm glad someone asked the right question," Sinclair began. "Mr. Small is gone, this we know. Where? We cannot say, and quite possibly will never know. What we do know is that Mr. Small was a Lothario, a fact he didn't even hide from his wife. In fact, his previous disappearances have all involved one of his chorus girls. But that's not the case in this situation, is it, Officer Dubois?" "No, it isn't, Detective," Dubois said, addressing the group. "I spoke to all the chorus girls and actresses in Mr. Small's employ. Their whereabouts have all been accounted for, and none have seen him since he walked away 2 weeks ago. He has also not turned up at any of the establishments he'd been known to frequent on his previous extended outings." "Thank you, Officer Dubois, and good work," Sinclair said. "It was my pleasure," Dubois said, with an almost imperceivable smirk. "Now, I've spoken to Mr. Doughty," Sinclair went on. "He is a man who has been mistreated and possibly misled by Mr. Small, but he is no killer. A thief who took advantage of a fortuitous situation, perhaps, but not a killer. Speaking of fortuitous situations, Mr. Tilbury, it seems you found a way into one as well." "What are you talking about? This has been a disaster for our deal," Tilbury said. "We need Mr. Small to complete the transaction. There's many anxious people back east waiting for this deal to be completed." Yes, the deal. $2 million for Mr. Small's theatre empire here in Louisiana. Quite the sum, Sinclair said. It stunned me when I first heard the figure, as a matter of fact. So I made some inquiries back in Boston with people I know in the banking industry. It seems $1 million, the amount paid and deposited to Mr. Small, is quite the limit of the investment group. $2 million is simply not possible for your clients. I don't know what you're talking about, Tilbury sputtered. Mr. Flock, Sinclair said, turning his attention to the portly lawyer. Remind me who is the beneficiary under Mr. Small's will. His wife, Mrs. Small, is, Flock responded. Mr. Flock, are you familiar with the legal doctrine of the Slayer's Rule? Sinclair asked. Of course, it states that a person responsible for someone's death may not benefit from that death, such as inheriting an estate, Flock explained, pausing at the end. And if Mrs. Small was found to have played a role in her husband's untimely disappearance, who would the estate go to? Sinclair asked. Well, he has no children, so it would be his surviving kin, namely his sisters Beatrice and Gladys Small, Flock replied. Yes, it would go to them, wouldn't it? Sinclair said, turning his attention to the two sisters. And now I pose this question to the Small sisters. Where did this notion that Mrs. Small hired an assassin to dispatch of your brother come from? Sinclair asked. From Mr. Tilbury, Beatrice responded. He said the assassin revealed himself to him. We met the killer, a most unsavory character who told us he did it. Mr. Tilbury even helped us go the newspaper with him to tell the story. Officer Murphy, Sinclair asked over his shoulder. Does that sound like the behavior of a paid assassin? Not one I've ever heard of, Detective, Murphy said. Not one that didn't want to be caught. Indeed, Sinclair said. An unsavory character emerges just at the right moment, with a story perfectly delivered to an eager and appreciative audience. What's that sound like to you, Officer Murphy? Sinclair asked. It sounds like someone acting like an assassin, Detective, he replied. An actor, Sinclair agreed. And what did Mr. Tilbury ask for in return for producing this story? Sinclair asked. He said all he asked in return was the completion of the sale of the theatres based on the money already paid, Gladys said quietly. Sinclair let the silence hang in the room for a minute. Then he began. So, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to summarize. Mr. Small agrees with Mr. Tilbury to sell his theatre chain for an exorbitant $2 million, an amount apparently so exorbitant that the group backing the deal only has half that sum. So after the initial $1 million is exchanged, our Mr. Small goes missing. Mr. Tilbury then makes use of the greed and distrust of the Small sisters by inventing the story of a paid assassin. The goal, of course, is to discredit Mrs. Small and disinherit her as the beneficiary of the estate. The final step would be finalizing the deal for significantly less than the agreed-upon $2 million purchase price. And all it would cost him is Mr. Small's life, and a nominal actor's fee. Officer Murphy stepped forward and placed one of his large, rough hands on Tilbury's shoulder. You're under arrest, Mr. Tilbury, he said. You haven't proven anything, Mr. Tilbury said, being led out of the room by Murphy. We might not ever be able to find Mr. Small, Sinclair conceded, but finding an actor flush with money and a story about his last performance making the front pages, he will be too easy to find. Mrs. Small, I'm sorry for your loss, Sinclair said, as he bid the group good night and stepped out of the room. Later that evening, Sinclair sat alone in his study, several candles illuminating the room in a soft orange glow. The image of Daniel Small, the once powerful theatre magnate, now reduced to a missing person, occupied his thoughts. Small hadn't been a good man during his life. He had mistreated his wife, his performers, his faithful assistant, and his sisters, leaving a trail of broken hearts and shattered dreams in his wake. But he didn't deserve the fate that had befallen him, whatever that fate might have been. But then, neither did his right-hand man, Doughty, a man once thought to be a loyal and devoted employee. Mr. Small's disappearance was both his saving grace and his downfall, as he was now facing the prospect of imprisonment for the theft from Small's safe. Sinclair sighed, a sense of weariness settling over him. The case had taken a toll on him, both physically and emotionally. He had followed the evidence as far as he could. His thoughts were interrupted by a light knock at his door. Opening it, he saw the two officers, Murphy and Dubois, standing on his front step. "We found the actor, Detective," Dubois said. "I got word from a couple of my informants that there was some new character buying rounds at the Laughing Skull Tavern down by the docks. It was our actor." "He gave us a full statement at the station," Murphy added. "Excellent work, officers," Sinclair said. "And now, good night." "Good night, Detective," Dubois said. "Until the next one."